In the spring of 1829, a discovery was made by a tenant farmer working the fields near the Delaware, Maryland border that would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. His plow horse suddenly sank into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age and his skull showing clear signs of violence. This was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, authorities on this property would uncover the bodies of at least 7 people, including 3 children. All were victims of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror throughout the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon had operated what historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But this wasn't just about human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who murdered rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children when they posed a threat to her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed the true number exceeded 20. Before we continue with the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to hear from you. What state or city are you listening from? The reach of Cannon's criminal network extended far beyond her Delaware stronghold, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and let me know where you're hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered. A criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade would ultimately be unraveled by the discovery of those buried remains, protected as it was by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the simple fact that most of its victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society. Uniquely suited for criminal activity was the area where Patty Cannon built her empire of terror. In the early 1800s, the region now known as Reliance sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to literally step across county and state lines to escape pursuing lawmen. So remote was the spot that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. For miles stretched dense forests of pine and oak, broken only by marshy lands and small clearings where isolated farmsteads dotted the countryside. Winding through the region was the Nanticoke River, providing waterways that could transport captives silently under cover of darkness. Little more than cart paths were the roads, and the nearest substantial towns were days away by horseback. For someone seeking to operate outside the law, it was an ideal location. Martha Cannon, called Patty by those who knew her, had arrived in this borderland sometime around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her origins deliberately vague. Some accounts place her birth in Canada with immigration to Delaware at age 16. Documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property near the state line. Together, they had at least 1 daughter and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable rural life. Described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept to himself was Jesse Cannon, working his small farm and raising tobacco and corn like dozens of other settlers in the region. Straddling the Delaware-Maryland border sat the Cannon homestead on a modest plot of land, a detail that would prove crucial to Patty's later criminal activities. The house itself was a simple 2-story structure built in the common style of the period with thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary home would soon house secret rooms and hidden spaces designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. But beneath this veneer of normalcy lay something far darker. A crucial period in American slavery was marked by the early 1800s. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, a lucrative domestic market was created by the demand for human labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. Powerful incentives for criminals willing to traffic in human misery were created by this price surge. An insatiable demand for enslaved labor had been created by the economic transformation of the South following the invention of the cotton gin. Rapidly expanding across the Gulf Coast states was cotton production, and planters were willing to pay premium prices for workers. The legal ban on importing slaves from Africa meant that the only source of new enslaved people was the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and re-enslavement of free African Americans. Particularly vulnerable to these predators was the Delmarva Peninsula. Following the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed by their owners, either through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Substantial populations of free African Americans who worked as laborious, artisans, and small farmers were had by Maryland and Delaware. In constant fear lived these communities, while legally free. They had no powerful protectors, limited legal recourse, and their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated by white authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. Precarious at best was the legal status of free African Americans in the early 1800s. While they were not enslaved, they possessed few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Patty Cannon, opportunities for exploitation were created by these legal vulnerabilities. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil recognizes no gender boundaries. A large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength for her gender is how contemporary accounts describe her. She stood nearly 6 foot tall in an era when most women barely reached 5 feet, and she possessed what neighbors described as an intimidating presence. Reportedly deep and commanding was her voice, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed. Under mysterious circumstances around 1826, her husband Jesse died. Some later claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property. By this time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror. Virtually non-existent in the rural border region was local law enforcement, and what little authority existed was often corrupt or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The social dynamics of the region also favored criminal enterprises. Sparse and often transient was the white population, consisting largely of small farmers, laborious, and people seeking to escape their pasts in more settled areas. Little sense of community cohesion was there, and neighbors often minded their own business, regardless of what they might suspect about their neighbors' activities. Crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so many years would prove this isolation and indifference. The transformation of Patty Cannon from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began with her daughters' marriages in a pattern that would define the next 2 decades. Slave kidnappers were both of the young women's husbands. Her first husband, Henry Brayton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brayton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. Well known in the local community long before his arrest had been Brayton's criminal activities. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. Perfect cover for his illegal activities was provided by this mobility. He would identify potential victims during his legitimate business calls, noting which families had teenage children or young adults who might bring high prices in southern slave markets. Often crude but effective were the methods employed by early kidnappers like Brayton. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life to capture their victims. A common technique involved approaching free African American families with offers of employment in distant locations. Parents desperate for economic opportunities for their children would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had signed their children's death warrants. It was after his escape that the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Brayton, working with Patty Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigidel at Cannon's tavern. Simple but brutal was the plan. Get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the witness. Court records show that Rigidel was shot and killed during the robbery. Eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, were Brayton and Griffith, but Patty Cannon escaped prosecution. A significant escalation in the criminal activity centered around the Cannon property was marked by the Rigidel murder. Prior to this incident, the family had been involved primarily in facilitating kidnappings and providing safe haven for criminals passing through the region. A level of ruthlessness that would characterize all of Cannon's future activities was demonstrated by the willingness to commit murder for profit. Disturbing details about the crime are provided by contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rigel case. The victim had been traveling through the region with a substantial amount of money, estimates suggest between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He had stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging. Unaware that he had walked into a trap, the conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigidell finally retired to his room, Brayton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting and the sound of a struggle followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigel was dead. His money was gone and his wagon and horses had disappeared. Hastily buried on the property was the body, beginning what would become a regular practice of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. Nothing to deter Cannon from her chosen path did the execution of her daughter's first husband do. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Brayton's capture was not that crime didn't pay, but rather that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson wasn't just another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and most importantly, the capital necessary to expand their operations beyond simple opportunistic crimes. A tavern located precisely on the Delaware-Maryland state line was brought to the partnership by Johnson. This establishment, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was positioned so strategically that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. Multiple purposes in the expanding criminal enterprise were served by the tavern. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons through the property. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them, a neutral ground where plans could be made and profits divided. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its multiple functions. Completely normal appeared the main floor with a common room for travelers, a bar area, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels that had been specially constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessible through concealed entrances and were designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured that captives wouldn't suffocate during long periods of confinement. Remarkably diverse for its time was the gang that assembled around Cannon and Johnson. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys such as John Purnell, who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. Strategic was this multiracial composition. African-American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately raising suspicions, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. Particularly valuable to the organization was John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto. His mixed racial heritage allowed him to move between white and African American communities with relative ease. He maintained multiple identities and could present himself as either a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business depending on the situation. An ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact made him this chameleon-like ability. Dramatically expanded as the 1820s progressed did the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula began Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker deeply committed to protecting free African Americans. The horrifying scale of the operation was revealed by Watson's investigations. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon Gang. The victims weren't just random targets. They were often specifically chosen for their vulnerability. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of labor. A level of organization that went far beyond. Opportunistic crime was demonstrated by the systematic nature of these kidnappings. Detailed intelligence about potential targets was maintained by the gang, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable to capture. They knew which young people had recently lost their jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman who was kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's Tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith recalled the constant fear, the inadequate food, and the knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Only her eventual rescue by Watson's network saved her from a lifetime of bondage. Crucial details about the conditions endured by victims of the Cannon Gang are provided by Smith's account. She described being seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers and transported by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey took several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained to prevent escape attempts. Upon arrival at the Cannon property, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the main house where she discovered she was not alone. Dozens of other kidnapped people at various times were contained in the underground holding areas, according to Smith's testimony. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. Deliberately harsh were the conditions: inadequate food, no sanitation facilities, and constant darkness, except when guards brought candles during feeding times. As brutal as the physical conditions was the psychological torture, as captives knew they were destined for sale into lifelong bondage. Details about the gang's methods for processing their human cargo were also provided by Smith. Victims were systematically stripped of any documentation proving their free status, and any personal belongings that might help identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and false backgrounds that would support their sale as legitimate slaves. Beaten until they complied were those who resisted or attempted to maintain their true identities. An open secret in the local community were the gang's operations. Neighbors knew that people disappeared near the Cannon property, that wagons arrived at odd hours, and that Johnson's Tavern hosted suspicious meetings, but the victims were African Americans in a society where their word carried little weight against that of white criminals. Local law enforcement, when it existed at all, showed little interest in investigating crimes against people they viewed as inherently suspicious. Beyond mere indifference went the complicity of the local white community in the gang's activities. Some neighbors actively supported the criminal enterprise, either through direct participation or by providing information about potential victims. The gang was supplied with provisions by local merchants, asking no questions about the source of their payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. Only when white victims entered the equation did this indifference change. The gang didn't just kidnap free African Americans. They also robbed and murdered slave traders who came through their territory carrying large amounts of cash. These victims were white men engaged in the legal slave trade. And their disappearances attracted the attention that African American victims never received. Around 1820 occurred the first documented case when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller vanished while traveling through the area. This man had been carrying a substantial sum of money. Some accounts suggest $35,000 intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment and his horse was later found in her possession. When questioned, Cannon claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of enslaved people, but investigators found this story implausible. The beginning of a pattern that would eventually lead to the gang's downfall was marked by the Georgia traders' disappearance. Unlike African American victims whose disappearances generated little official interest, missing white slave traders had business partners and financial backers who demanded investigations. These men carried substantial amounts of money and had planned itineraries that made their disappearances difficult to explain away. Typically brutal was Cannon's method for dealing with these victims. The traders would be invited to the tavern under the pretense of conducting legitimate business. Once there, they would be plied with alcohol and encouraged to discuss their financial resources and travel plans. When the opportunity arose, they would be murdered and robbed, their bodies buried on the property, and their money and any enslaved people they were traveling with would be incorporated into the gang's operations. Substantial were the profits from these murders. A single slave trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's operations for months. The enslaved people they were transporting could be sold through the gang's southern networks, generating additional income. Most importantly, eliminating these competitors helped the gang maintain their monopoly on criminal activities in the region. From multiple directions was pressure mounting on the Cannon-Johnson gang by the mid-1820s. Mayor Watson of Philadelphia had begun offering substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, and Governor John Andrew Schultzer of Pennsylvania was coordinating with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Not just individual crimes, but a systematic network that had been operating for over a decade were their investigations revealing. A substantial sum for the period was represented by the reward offered by Watson, $500 for information leading to arrests, equivalent to several months' wages for most working people. This financial incentive began to loosen tongues in communities that had previously remained silent about the gang's activities. Former associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even some victims who had managed to escape began providing information to authorities. Characteristically violent was the gang's response to this pressure. Rather than scaling back their operations, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. Their downfall would ultimately prove to be this decision as it expanded their list of victims to include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset was reflected in the escalation in violence during this period. She had built a criminal empire that generated enormous profits. Estimates suggest the gang's annual income exceeded $50,000, a fortune by early 19th century standards. But this success had made her a target for law enforcement attention, and she became convinced that former associates posed an existential threat to her operations. A mixed-race boy named Cyrus James was the most crucial figure in the gang's eventual exposure. Cannon had purchased James as a slave when he was only 7 years old and had raised him in her household. As he grew older, James was forced to participate in the gang's activities, serving as a decoy to lure other African Americans into traps. His intimate knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his growing revulsion at the violence he witnessed, made him both an invaluable asset and a potential liability. Unique and tragically complex was James' position in the Cannon household. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to participate in whatever activities his owner demanded. But as he matured, he began to understand the full horror of what he was being forced to do. He was helping to destroy the lives of people who looked like him, people who shared his heritage and his vulnerability. This knowledge created an internal conflict that would eventually lead him to cooperate with authorities despite the personal risks involved. Sophisticated and cruel was the psychological manipulation employed by Cannon to control James. She alternated between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal masters in the Deep South. She convinced him that his survival depended entirely on her protection and that any betrayal would result in his immediate death. This combination of dependency and terror kept James loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific crimes. Multiple children on her property were witnessed being murdered by Cannon, James later testified. In one particularly horrific account, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded African-American child, not yet dead, from the house in her apron, only for the child to never return. James knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help dispose of them. Not random acts of violence, but calculated decisions based on Cannon's assessment of risk and profit were the murders James witnessed. Children who became sick or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would have been expensive and would have attracted unwanted attention. Young people who proved difficult to control or who maintained their insistence on their free status were eliminated as potential sources of trouble. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon determined they would be more trouble than they were worth. With their treatment of rival slave traders began the gang's undoing. Competition in the illegal human trafficking trade was fierce, and Cannon's gang had developed a reputation for murdering competitors to steal their money and their human cargo. This practice accelerated as legitimate law enforcement pressure increased. Dead slave traders couldn't testify about their experiences with the gang. Both Cannon's growing desperation and her fundamental miscalculation about the consequences of such actions were reflected in the decision to escalate their violence against white victims. She had operated for so long with impunity that she believed herself untouchable. The murder of African Americans had generated no serious law enforcement response, so she assumed that the same would be true for white victims. This assumption would prove fatal to her criminal enterprise. In early 1829, the bodies began to surface. A tenant farmer working land owned by Cannon was plowing a low-lying area that had recently been cleared of brush when his horse stumbled into what proved to be a grave. Inside a wooden chest, he discovered human bones that authorities determined belonged to the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery triggered a systematic search of the property that would uncover multiple burial sites. Land that Cannon had rented out for additional income was being worked by the farmer who made the initial discovery. The area had previously been unused because it was prone to flooding, but recent dry weather had made it suitable for cultivation. When the farmer's plow horse suddenly sank into the ground, he initially assumed he had encountered a natural depression or perhaps an old well. It was only when he began digging to free his horse that he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister. Remarkably well preserved was the wooden chest containing the bones, suggesting it had been buried relatively recently, despite containing decade-old remains. Specifically constructed for the purpose of concealing a body appeared the chest itself, with dimensions that precisely accommodated a human form. This level of preparation indicated that the burial was not a hasty attempt to conceal a crime, but rather part of a systematic approach to body disposal that had been refined over years of practice. A chain of events that would finally bring Patty Cannon's criminal empire to an end was set in motion by the discovery of the first body in early 1829. Delaware authorities working with their counterparts in Maryland obtained search warrants and began a comprehensive investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. Led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, working in coordination with Maryland authorities and representatives from the Pennsylvania Governor's Office, was the investigation. This multi-jurisdictional approach was unprecedented for the time period and reflected the growing recognition that the Cannon gang's activities crossed state boundaries and required coordinated law enforcement response. Remarkably broad were the search warrants obtained by authorities, allowing them to excavate any areas of the Cannon properties where bodies might be concealed. This legal authority was crucial as it provided protection for investigators who might otherwise have been accused of trespassing or illegal search and seizure. The warrants also specified that any evidence discovered could be used in prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, helping to close the legal loopholes that the gang had exploited for years. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The circumstances of his arrest remain somewhat unclear, but court records suggest he was attempting to flee the region when he was apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution, the young man, who had been forced into a life of crime as a child, made a fateful decision. He would cooperate with authorities and reveal everything he knew about Patty Cannon's operations. Not made lightly by James was the decision to cooperate. He understood that his testimony would likely result in his own prosecution for the crimes he had been forced to commit. But he also recognized that continued silence would mean protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to participate in the destruction of countless other lives. Not just a legal strategy, but a moral choice to finally break free from the psychological control that Cannon had maintained over him for years, was represented by his cooperation. Devastating was James' testimony. Speaking to a justice of the peace in Seaford, Delaware, he provided detailed accounts of murders spanning nearly a decade. He told investigators that Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating supper at Cannon's house. He had watched them carry the body to a wooden chest and bury it on the property. But this was just the beginning of his revelations. Extraordinary was the level of detail in James's testimony and provided investigators with their first comprehensive understanding of the gang's operations. He was able to describe not just individual crimes, but the systematic methods employed by the gang over many years. He knew the locations of burial sites, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to transport kidnapped people, and the networks of buyers and sellers that stretched across multiple states. Following James's directions, authorities began excavating the Cannon property systematically. In a garden area, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James' testimony, this child had been enslaved by Cannon along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. The article preserving this testimony contains no information about the fate of the child's mother, leaving open the horrifying possibility that she too was murdered. Particularly disturbing to investigators was the discovery of the child's body because it demonstrated the extent of Cannon's callousness. This was not a victim of kidnapping or a rival criminal. This was a child who had been born into Cannon's household and lived under her control. The murder appeared to have been motivated purely by Cannon's racist paranoia and her fear that a mixed-race child might somehow threaten her operations. 2 wooden boxes, each containing human bones, were revealed by additional excavations. James identified one set of remains as belonging to another child he had seen Cannon beat to death with a piece of wood. The third set belonged to an adult whom James described as someone they considered had property, meaning the gang believed this person was free and might have resources worth stealing. A picture of Cannon as something beyond a simple criminal was painted by the systematic nature of these murders. She was a serial killer who had been operating with impunity for years, protected by the isolation of her location, the indifference of local authorities to crimes against African Americans, and a network of co-conspirators who shared in her profits. In remarkable detail, the physical evidence discovered during the excavations corroborated James's testimony. The wooden boxes used to contain bodies were of similar construction, suggesting they had been specifically manufactured for the purpose of concealing murder victims. The locations of the graves followed a pattern that indicated systematic planning rather than random burial. Most disturbing, the condition of the remains suggested that some victims had been buried while still alive. As news of the discovery spread, other witnesses began coming forward. People who had lived in fear of Cannon for years suddenly found the courage to speak. Their testimonies revealed additional victims and provided details about the gang's methods that corroborated James's account. Among these new witnesses was Thomas Freeman, a free African American who had been approached by gang members in 1827 but had managed to escape. Freeman testified that he had been offered work in Georgia and had been traveling toward the Cannon property when he became suspicious of his escort's behavior. He managed to slip away during a rest stop and spent several days hiding in the woods before making his way back to Philadelphia. Significant was Freeman's testimony because it provided insight into the gang's recruitment methods. He described how the initial approach had seemed completely legitimate. He had been struggling to find work in Philadelphia when a well-dressed man approached him with an offer of employment on a Georgia plantation. The wages offered were generous, and transportation was to be provided free of charge. It was only during the journey that Freeman began to notice inconsistencies in his escort stories and became suspicious of their true intentions. Beyond Delaware expanded the scope of the investigation. Authorities in Maryland began examining properties owned by gang members while officials in Pennsylvania coordinated efforts to document the full extent of the kidnapping network. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Sussex County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the final chapter of Patty Cannon's reign of terror. A new approach to law enforcement that would later become standard practice was represented by the coordination between different jurisdictions. For the first time, authorities were treating the Cannon gang as what it truly was, an interstate criminal conspiracy that required federal-level response. This recognition led to the involvement of officials from Washington, D.C. and marked the beginning of what would eventually become coordinated federal law enforcement efforts against organized crime. On April 13, 1829, indictments against Martha Patty Cannon on 4 counts of murder were handed down by a grand jury of 24 white men in Delaware. The charges were signed by James Rogers, the Attorney General of Delaware, and represented the first time any member of the notorious gang had faced serious legal consequences for their crimes against African Americans. Significant for the period was the composition of the grand jury itself. All 24 members were white males as required by Delaware law, but they represented a cross-section of the state's population, including farmers, merchants, and professionals. The fact that this jury was willing to indict a white woman for the murder of African Americans marked a notable shift in legal attitudes driven largely by the overwhelming evidence presented and the interstate nature of the crimes. Remarkably specific for the era were the indictments. Cannon was charged with the murder of an infant female on April 26, 1822, a male child on the same date, an adult male on October 1, 1820, and a Negro boy on June 1, 1824. Each charge carried the death penalty, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. The thorough investigation conducted by authorities was reflected in the specificity of these charges. Unlike many criminal cases of the period which relied primarily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence, the Cannon case was built on physical evidence, multiple corroborating witnesses, and detailed confessions from a participant who had intimate knowledge of the crimes. This combination of evidence types made the case virtually impossible to defend against. The backbone of the prosecution's case was formed by Cyrus James' testimony. His detailed knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his ability to lead authorities to burial sites, made him the most valuable witness in Delaware legal history up to that point. The young man who had been forced into crime as a child now held the power to bring justice to the woman who had terrorized the region for decades. Led by Attorney General James Rogers, who had made his reputation prosecuting complex criminal cases across Delaware, was the prosecution team. Rogers understood that the Cannon case represented an opportunity to demonstrate that the law applied equally to all citizens regardless of their race or social status. He also recognized that a successful prosecution would send a strong message to other criminal enterprises operating in the region. But a figure that defied easy categorization even for her contemporaries was presented by Patty Cannon herself. A large, physically powerful woman who commanded fear and respect, even from hardened criminals, is how newspaper accounts described her. At approximately 70 years old, she remained sharp-minded and defiant, showing no remorse for her actions, even when confronted with irrefutable evidence. An unrepentant criminal who seemed genuinely puzzled by the legal proceedings against her is painted by contemporary descriptions of Cannon during her imprisonment. She apparently viewed her actions as legitimate business activities and expressed bewilderment that authorities were prosecuting her for crimes against people she considered to be property rather than human beings. Both the seriousness of her crimes and the unusual nature of having a female defendant facing multiple murder charges were reflected in the conditions of her imprisonment in the Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, Delaware. She was kept under constant guard as authorities feared both escape attempts and potential retaliation from surviving gang members. A crude stone structure that had been built in the early 1800s to house petty criminals and debtors was the Georgetown Jail itself. It was not designed to hold dangerous felons facing capital charges, and authorities had to implement special security measures to ensure Cannon's continued detention. Extra guards were posted and her cell was reinforced with additional iron bars and locks. During her confinement, Cannon began to speak more freely about her criminal career. According to contemporary accounts, she admitted to killing at least 24 people over the course of her criminal career. These victims included not just the African Americans found buried on her property, but also rival slave traders, potential witnesses, and anyone else who posed a threat to her operations. The most chilling aspect of Cannon's confessions was their matter-of-fact tone. She spoke of murder as a business necessity, describing the killing of children and adults with the same casual indifference she might have used to discuss livestock. Her apparent lack of any moral conscience shocked even hardened law enforcement officials who had seen the worst of frontier violence. Details about crimes that extended far beyond the charges for which she had been indicted were provided by Cannon's confessions to authorities. She described murders dating back to the early 1810s, kidnappings that had involved hundreds of victims, and a criminal network that had reached into multiple states. These revelations confirmed investigators' suspicions that the crimes discovered on her property represented only a fraction of the gang's total activities. With unusual speed for the period moved forward the legal proceedings. The overwhelming evidence combined with public pressure for justice created momentum for a quick trial and resolution. Court records suggest that Cannon was expected to face trial within weeks of her indictment, with execution to follow shortly thereafter if she were convicted. Straightforward was the prosecution's strategy. Present the physical evidence, provide testimony from Cyrus James and other witnesses, and allow the jury to reach the obvious conclusion that Cannon was guilty of multiple murders. The defense, such as it was, could only argue for mercy based on Cannon's age and gender, though few observers believed such arguments would be effective given the horrific nature of the crimes. In late May 1829 was the trial scheduled to begin, with jury selection planned for the week before. Legal observers from across the region were expected to attend as the case represented one of the most significant criminal prosecutions in Delaware history. Newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Baltimore were planning extensive coverage of the proceedings. Never reached their intended conclusion with the legal proceedings against Patty Cannon. On May 11, 1829, approximately 3 weeks before her scheduled execution, jail guards found her dead in her cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by poison, though the exact circumstances remain unclear. Some accounts suggest she had been smuggled arsenic by sympathizers, while others propose she had been hoarding medication for weeks. Shock waves through the Georgetown jail and the broader community were sent by the discovery of Cannon's body. Guards making their regular morning rounds found her lying on the floor of her cell, apparently having died sometime during the night. There were no signs of struggle or violence, and the cell remained securely locked from the outside. The only evidence of what had occurred was a small vial found hidden in her clothing, which later analysis suggested had contained arsenic. A mystery that investigators never fully resolved remained the question of how Cannon obtained the poison. The jail security procedures were relatively lax by modern standards, and visitors were not thoroughly searched before meeting with prisoners. It was possible that a sympathizer had smuggled the poison to her during one of these visits, though no specific individual was ever identified as the source. From the moment of her arrest had Cannon been planning her suicide, speculated some contemporaries. She had witnessed the execution of her daughter's first husband and understood exactly what fate awaited her if she were convicted. Rather than face the public humiliation of execution, she chose to die on her own terms, maintaining control over her fate until the very end. Her death robbed the victims' families of the satisfaction of seeing justice served, but it also brought to a close one of the most systematic criminal enterprises in early American history. Effectively ended the reverse Underground Railroad that had operated along the Delmarva Peninsula for nearly 2 decades, court records show, did Cannon's death. Chaotic was the immediate aftermath of Cannon's death. Authorities had been preparing for what they expected to be the most significant criminal trial in Delaware history, and her suicide left them with unresolved questions about the full extent of her criminal network. The investigation into her activities continued for several months, but without her testimony, many details about the gang's operations remained unclear. Varied was the fate of her surviving co-conspirators. Joseph Johnson, her son-in-law and primary partner, had fled to Alabama or Mississippi before the investigations began. His brother Ebenezer also escaped to the Deep South.